I was 26 the summer I decided to take a long solo camping trip deep into the wild parts of northern Arizona. It was 2019, and I had been saving for months to take a long break from work, clear my head. I had gotten a cheap secondhand truck, loaded it with supplies, a thick canvas tent, a used sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, and a heavy cooler full of what I thought would last me 2 weeks. The spot I picked wasn't an official campground. It was a patch of land near the Navajo Nation, out past Tuba City, way off the paved roads. It was open, scrubby land with low brush, patches of thick trees, and long rocky stretches that crunched under your boots. Hardly anyone came out there. It felt like the middle of nowhere, and that's exactly what I wanted. The first few days were peaceful. I set up my tent near a slight rise where I could see a good distance all around. I spent my mornings hiking the shallow canyons and scattered mesas, afternoons fishing in a small creek a few miles away, and evenings sitting by the fire as the sky burned orange, then purple, then black. I kept a journal, wrote down everything I noticed: the way the sun cracked the earth, the strange shape of the clouds, the lizards darting across the rocks. I felt good, alive, like I had stepped out of the noisy, crowded world and found something older, slower. On the fourth night, after a long hike back from the creek, something felt off. I couldn't really explain it. The wind had picked up, whispering through the low sagebrush, and there was a smell in the air. A dry, dusty smell, but with something else underneath it. Something sour, metallic. I brushed it off. Maybe it was the wind stirring up something dead. I had seen plenty of animal bones scattered around. Deer, coyotes, even what looked like a wild horse once. I built a fire and cooked some beans over the flames. I watched the stars blink awake. It got colder than usual that night. The wind howled low, almost like a voice, threading through the bushes. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I left the fire burning low. I figured the light might keep any curious animals away. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound. It was sharp, too quick to be the wind. A snapping of branches close to the tent. My heart kicked up, fast and hard. I laid still, ears straining. Another snap, then a soft scrape, like something dragging across the canvas of the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I didn't have a gun, just a heavy hunting knife strapped to my belt. The smart part of me whispered to stay quiet, stay small. Minutes dragged by. Eventually, the sounds faded. I don't know how long I lay there, stiff as a board, before I finally passed out again, the adrenaline finally burning out. In the morning, there were tracks outside the tent. Not boot prints, not paw prints either. They were weird, long, wide, with deep impressions at the toe, like claws had dug into the dirt. My first thought was a bear, but it didn't seem right. Too narrow, too long. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had and moved camp a few miles down, closer to the creek. I set up in a thick patch of juniper trees, hidden from open view. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a sick coyote, staggering around on 2 legs the way injured ones sometimes do. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin and dry. The next 2 days were fine. I kept busy, hiked farther, fished longer. But at night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of the brush, set my nerves on edge. On the 7th night, I made the mistake of wandering too far from camp after dark. I had been following the creek upstream, watching the way the last light turned the water into a ribbon of silver. I didn't realize how fast the sun was dropping behind the mesas. When it finally clicked, the world had already gone purple-blue. I turned back fast, stumbling over rocks, my flashlight bobbing wild beams across the ground. The trees crowded closer the farther I went, their twisted trunks throwing long, crooked shadows. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't close, not yet, but it was behind me, following. I broke into a run. I didn't care about stepping quiet anymore. I crashed through the brush, heart hammering, ears full of the sound of my own breath. I didn't stop until I saw the flicker of my fire through the trees. I dove into camp, yanking my knife from my belt, spinning around. Nothing there. I stayed up all night by the fire, shivering from more than just the cold. I kept the flames high, feeding it everything I could find. Sticks, branches, even some of my notebook pages when the wood got low. Every time the fire cracked and popped, I flinched. The next morning, I told myself I'd had enough. I packed up everything, crammed it all into the truck, and headed out. But the roads out there were rough, nothing but narrow dirt tracks twisted through the brush. I hadn't gone 10 miles before one of the tires blew out. I cursed under my breath, pulled over, and got out to check. It was shredded, like something had slashed it, not just a normal pop. I didn't have a spare. I cursed myself harder. Stupid mistake. I had gotten too cocky, too far out. There was no cell service. I was at least 25 miles from the nearest highway. No choice but to walk. I stuffed a few essentials into my backpack. Water, the knife, some beef jerky, and started walking back toward the nearest road, boots kicking up little puffs of dust. The heat was brutal. The sun baked down. The horizon wavered with false rivers of shimmering heat. After a few hours, I noticed I wasn't alone. I saw it first as a shape in the distance, too big for a coyote, too lean for a bear. It moved weird, loping, almost limping, but fast. Every time I looked straight at it, it seemed to pause, like it knew I could see it. I kept walking, fast, eyes on the dirt road, one foot in front of the other. I didn't look back again for a long time. When I finally did, it was closer, a lot closer. I still couldn't make out details, just that it was wrong. Too long in the limbs, head cocked at a strange angle. I wanted to run, but I knew it would chase me if I did. I had to be smart, stay calm. I kept walking, slower now, acting like I hadn't seen it. My mouth was dry as dust. Every nerve screamed at me to bolt. It stayed back about 50 yards, just enough that I could see it if I glanced over my shoulder. The sun started to dip lower. Long shadows crept across the land. I could feel the temperature dropping fast, the sweat on my back turning cold. Around twilight, I saw something that nearly made me cry with relief. An old, broken-down cattle pen, sagging into the earth. There was a small shed nearby, half collapsed but still standing. Shelter. I made for it, fast but not running. The door to the shed hung crooked, swinging on one hinge. I ducked inside, pulled it shut as best I could, and shoved an old broken crate against it. Inside, it stank of rot and mold. Mice scurried in the corners, but it was something. I crouched in the far corner, knife out, listening to the wind scream through the cracks. After maybe half an hour, I heard it, sniffing at the door, soft at first, then harder, a low, wet growl rumbling from deep in its chest. The door creaked under the pressure. The whole shed groaned. Dust fell from the beams above. I gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt. I thought about making a break for it, but where would I go? Open land for miles. It would run me down in seconds. The thing paced outside for hours. I could hear its nails clicking on the wood, the heavy scrape of its body brushing the walls. Then, just before dawn, it stopped. Silence. I waited, barely breathing, until the first weak gray light started leaking into the shed. Only then did I crack the door and peek out. Nothing there. I slipped out, heart hammering, every nerve on fire. I didn't see it anywhere. I didn't stop moving. I didn't even look back. I just started walking, faster than I thought possible, toward the highway. Took hours. My feet blistered. My throat felt like sandpaper. But around mid-morning, a battered old pickup rumbled up the road. A rancher. I must have looked like hell because he didn't ask a lot of questions. Just waved me into the cab and handed me a bottle of warm water. He dropped me off in Tuba City, and from there, I got a bus back toward Phoenix. I left the truck behind. I didn't care. I didn't even file an insurance claim. I never went back for my camping gear either. For months after, I had nightmares about the smell, the shape, the way it moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't just been an animal. That maybe it had been a person once. A person twisted and broken by something too heavy to carry. People like to talk about skinwalkers out there, witches, shapeshifters. But what scared me wasn't the old stories. It was how real it all felt, how close it got, how it didn't need magic to be something that hunted me across the empty land. It was real enough. It was late September 2014 when I decided to go on a camping trip alone. I was 27 then, working some boring office job in Little Rock, Arkansas. Life felt like it was passing by in slow motion, and I needed a break from the constant buzzing of fluorescent lights and ringing phones. I camped a few times before, mostly with friends, but never really alone. Something about doing it solo felt like it would clear my head. I picked a place called Hollow Creek Forest. It wasn't a touristy spot, barely even showed up on maps unless you really zoomed in. A friend of mine mentioned it once, said it was peaceful, had a small lake deep inside, and barely anyone ever went there. That sounded perfect to me. I packed my old camping gear, enough food and water for a few days, a little hatchet, my heavy flashlight, a good survival knife I barely ever used, and some basic first aid supplies. I tossed everything into my beat-up Toyota Tacoma and left town before the sun was even up. The drive was about 3 hours, long stretches of empty 2-lane roads, sometimes passing a tiny gas station or an old farmhouse sitting lonely against the fields. When I finally got to the dirt road that led to Hollow Creek, I almost missed it. No signs, just a gap in the trees and 2 deep tire ruts leading into the woods. The road was rough, and after about 15 minutes of crawling along at a walking pace, I found a little clearing big enough to park my truck and still leave room for other cars, though there weren't any others around. I cut the engine, grabbed my pack, and locked the truck up tight. I left a note on the dashboard, just my name, phone number, and back Sunday night, in case something went wrong. I don't know why I did that. It just felt smart. I hiked about 2 miles into the woods before I picked a spot to set up. It was right near the edge of a wide clearing, with thick trees on 3 sides and a little path leading off toward what I guessed was the lake. I pitched my old green tent, stacked some dry wood into a pile for a fire later, and set out my sleeping bag and small foam pad inside. Everything was quiet, except for the wind brushing through the leaves and the occasional crow calling out from somewhere far off. Felt peaceful, exactly what I needed. That first day, I didn't do much except explore a little. I followed the path down to the lake, a dark, still thing with thick weeds along the banks. It smelled like wet mud and old plants. I skipped some stones, sat for a while, then headed back to my camp before the light faded too much. I made a small fire, heated up a can of chili, and just sat there under the stars. I didn't even bother checking my phone. I doubted there was any signal out here anyway. The first night was cold. I bundled into my sleeping bag, listening to the forest noises around me. Crickets, the occasional snap of a branch, maybe a raccoon or something digging through the leaves. Took me a long time to fall asleep, but eventually I did. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. The fire had long since died out, and the air inside the tent was freezing. I made some instant coffee on my little camp stove, ate a granola bar, and decided to hike further along the path past the lake. I packed some water, my knife, and a few snacks and set off. The woods got thicker the deeper I went. Trees pressed close together, their branches high overhead like a woven roof. The ground was soft with layers of old leaves, and every step made a soft crunching sound. After maybe 2 hours, I found something strange. A fence, not a modern one either. It was old, made of rough wood, half fallen in places. It stretched off into the trees in both directions, and on the other side, the woods looked even thicker. Curious, I followed the fence to the right. After about 20 minutes, I saw what it was surrounding. An old, broken-down cabin. It looked abandoned, leaning slightly to one side, its windows boarded up or shattered. The roof sagged, and there was a pile of rusted metal, maybe an old stove in the weeds nearby. There were no paths leading to it, no clearings, no signs that anyone had been here in years. Something about it made my skin crawl a little. I don't know why. It's just wood and nails, I told myself. Probably just an old hunting cabin. Still, I didn't go any closer. I turned around and started back toward my own camp. When I got back, everything looked the same. Tent was fine, my fire ring undisturbed. I spent the afternoon gathering some more firewood and fishing a little at the lake, though I didn't catch anything. The whole time, though, I kept thinking about that cabin. Who built it? Why was it fenced off? It felt out of place somehow, like it didn't belong to the rest of the forest. That second night was worse. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon roof of the tent, I kept hearing noises outside. Not animal sounds, at least not ones I recognized. It was like soft footsteps, crunch, pause, crunch, then nothing. I told myself it was just deer. Hollow Creek was supposed to have tons of deer, maybe even a bear, though I hadn't seen any real signs of them. But it didn't feel like that. The steps sounded too deliberate, too slow, like someone trying to be quiet. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, heart pounding, my hand gripping the handle of my knife under the sleeping bag. Eventually, the sounds faded, and somehow I drifted off. When I woke up, the sun was already high. I stepped outside and scanned the area carefully. Everything looked fine. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anything unusual. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like wet clothes. That day, I didn't go far. I stayed near my camp, gathering firewood, reading a little from the battered paperback I'd brought, and trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. But all afternoon, I felt watched, like there were eyes on me, just beyond the trees. That night, I built a bigger fire, hoping the light would keep anything, or anyone, away. I sat close to it, poking at the logs with a stick, listening to the forest crackling and shifting in the dark. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. They were slow, almost careful, like someone testing each step before putting their weight down. I killed the fire as fast as I could, stamping it out with dirt and scattering the logs. Darkness swallowed me, and I crouched low, straining to hear. My heart slammed so hard in my ears that I almost couldn't hear anything else. The steps came closer. I couldn't see anything, the flashlight was inside the tent, but I could feel it. Someone was out there. Someone was watching. I stayed crouched for what felt like forever, barely breathing. Eventually, the steps moved away, slowly, fading into the distance. I waited another hour before I dared move. I slipped into the tent, grabbed my knife and flashlight, and sat there with my back against the fabric, eyes wide open until the first gray light of dawn. I decided I was leaving. I hadn't signed up for this. Alone camping was one thing. Feeling hunted was another. I packed up as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat a handful of trail mix. Every few minutes I froze, listening for those slow, deliberate steps. But the woods stayed quiet. As I was stuffing the tent into its bag, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. About 20 feet from where I slept, carved into the trunk of a tree, was a small symbol. 3 vertical slashes, side by side, each about 6 inches long. Fresh cuts, the exposed wood was still pale. I hadn't put it there. I should have run then and there, but I couldn't stop staring at it. Felt like a warning. I shouldered my pack and started back toward the truck. Every few steps, I checked over my shoulder. The walk that had taken 2 hours to hike in felt like it took 4 to hike out. The woods pressed in tighter than I remembered, every shadow feeling too deep, every gust of wind making me jump. When I finally saw the clearing where I'd left my truck, relief flooded me. But it died just as quickly. My truck was sitting there, sure, but the back window was smashed in. Glass glittered across the seat like ice. Someone had been inside. My stomach dropped. I crept closer, knife in hand, scanning the trees around me. I checked the truck. Nothing obvious missing, but everything inside had been rifled through. My glove box hung open, papers scattered everywhere. Even my emergency kit had been pulled out and dumped onto the ground. I didn't think. I just climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life and I tore out of there, tires throwing dirt behind me. The whole drive back, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sprinting after me through the trees. When I finally got back to town, I didn't even go home first. I drove straight to the police station. I told them everything about the cabin, the footsteps, the symbol, the break-in. They wrote it all down, asked me if anything had been stolen. I said no, and promised to send someone to check the area. I don't know if they ever did. They didn't seem very concerned. Maybe they thought I was just a scared city boy jumping at shadows. For weeks after, I kept thinking about that place. About the fence, I had always loved getting away from people when life got too loud. In 2017, I was 27 and working long, weird shifts as a maintenance guy at an apartment complex in Colorado Springs. Summer had been brutal that year. Lots of broken air conditioners, grumpy tenants, and calls at 2 in the morning because someone's toilet overflowed again. I'd saved up some vacation days and decided to take a week off in late September. It was getting cool, but not freezing yet. Perfect time to go camping. I didn't want to go to a normal campground where people park their RVs and blast music all night. I wanted real quiet, real space. I found a spot online when I was poking around on maps late one night. An old fire lookout tower deep in the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest in Montana. The tower had been abandoned for decades. Some hikers said the trail leading up to it was rough and overgrown, but you could camp near the bottom of the hill where the forest opened into a little meadow. It sounded perfect. I loaded up my truck with my old green canvas tent, a heavy sleeping bag, a cooler full of simple food, a camp stove, a bunch of water jugs, and enough gear to survive a week if something stupid happened. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just left a general area with my neighbor in case something went wrong. I figured I'd be fine. I was young, stubborn, and thought I had seen enough in my life to handle anything. The drive took almost 12 hours, but the last few hours were the worst. The paved roads turned into rough gravel, and then into what barely even looked like a road at all. I had to slow way down to crawl over rocks and through deep ruts. Trees leaned in close on both sides like they were trying to block the sun out. It was late afternoon by the time I found a spot that looked flat enough to set up camp. The meadow wasn't very big, maybe the size of a soccer field, surrounded by thick forest that climbed up into the hills. The lookout tower stood halfway up the nearest hill, barely visible through the trees. It looked rough, half the walls missing, one side leaning a little like the next good storm might finish it off. The trail leading up to it was almost invisible except for a few old wooden signs nailed to trees. Their paint so faded I couldn't read them. I set up my tent near the edge of the meadow, facing the forest. It felt safer being close to the trees somehow, like I wouldn't be a sitting duck out in the open. The air was clean and cold enough that you could see your breath a little as the sun started to dip. It smelled like pine sap, dirt, and old leaves. I got a fire going with some dry wood I gathered nearby and made myself a simple dinner. Canned chili heated up on my little stove, a bag of crackers, and a bottle of water. I sat by the fire and watched the last light fade from the sky. The stars came out thick and bright, more than I had seen in years. I didn't even realize how noisy the city was until I sat there and listened to the quiet. The first night was fine, cold but fine. I slept hard, wrapped in my sleeping bag with a wool blanket over the top for extra warmth. I woke up once when something crunched in the brush nearby, probably a deer, but it didn't bother me too much. I just listened for a minute, heart thumping a little, and when the sounds moved off into the trees, I went back to sleep. The second day, I decided to check out the old tower. I packed a day bag with water, some granola bars, my pocket knife, and a flashlight just in case. The trail was worse than I thought. Trees had fallen across it, and I had to climb over them or find ways around. Thick underbrush grabbed at my legs. I moved slow and careful, not wanting to twist an ankle out here alone. Getting close to the tower, I felt a weird kind of nervousness. It looked even worse up close. The wooden steps were broken in places, and the metal frame was covered in rust. The floorboards creaked under my boots when I carefully stepped inside. There wasn't much left inside, just a couple broken chairs, the remains of an old desk, some smashed glass from the windows. Graffiti covered the walls. Most of it was the usual junk, names, dumb messages. A few looked a little stranger, things like, "Don't stay," and "He watches." But I figured it was just bored kids trying to spook people. Still, I didn't stay long. The place felt like it was leaning a little more every time the wind blew. I took a few pictures on my phone and picked my way back down the hill. By the time I got back to camp, It was late afternoon again. I got another fire going, made some instant soup, and sat by the flames until it was too cold to stay outside. That night was when things started feeling wrong. I was zipped up in my sleeping bag, just starting to drift off, when I heard something. Slow, heavy footsteps in the leaves. Not a deer, not the quick shuffle of a raccoon. These were slow, careful steps. I held my breath and listened. They stopped maybe 20 feet from my tent. I stayed frozen, heart hammering so loud I was sure whoever it was could hear it. After a minute, the steps moved again. Not toward me, but around me, circling. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves with every slow step. I didn't move. I didn't even think about turning on a light. I just lay there, tense and sweating, until finally the steps moved off into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there in the dark, wide-eyed, listening. When dawn finally came, I crawled out of the tent, stiff and cold. I looked around the campsite. Nothing seemed disturbed. No trash rummaged through, no marks in the dirt that I could see. I told myself it was probably just a curious animal, maybe a bear, but deep down I didn't really believe it. Bears didn't walk in circles around tents in the middle of the night. I almost packed up and left right then, but I told myself I was overreacting. I had enough supplies and I was fine. Maybe I was just too used to the noise of the city, and real silence was playing tricks on me. The third day, I stuck closer to camp. I didn't want to go hiking again. I spent the morning gathering more firewood and double-checking my gear. Around noon, I noticed something weird. One of the wooden signs nailed to a tree near the trail, the one with the faded paint, was gone. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it had finally rotted off and fallen. But when I walked over to check, I couldn't find it anywhere on the ground. That evening, I built my fire early and kept it big. I didn't want the dark pressing in so hard. I ate a cold dinner because I didn't want to turn my back on the woods long enough to cook. The sun went down fast, and the shadows got deep and thick. That night, the steps came back. Same slow, deliberate pacing around my tent. I didn't breathe. I barely blinked. They came closer this time. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot. I could even hear soft breathing, like someone trying hard not to make noise but failing. At one point, something brushed against the side of my tent. Just a light touch, like the tip of a finger trailing along the fabric. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, my knife, my keys, and making a run for the truck. But the truck was parked 50 yards away, on the other side of the clearing. If whoever was out there wanted to stop me, they could easily do it before I even got halfway. I stayed put, heart hammering, every muscle locked up. Hours seemed to drag by before the footsteps moved off again. But I still didn't sleep. I waited, tense, until the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn. When I finally unzipped my tent and stepped out, I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the ground, right in front of my tent door, was the missing wooden sign, propped up carefully, like someone had placed it there on purpose. The paint was so faded you could barely make it out, but under the old graffiti you could still read 3 words. Not safe here. That was it for me. I packed up faster than I thought possible. I didn't even bother folding my tent properly, just stuffed it into the truck bed. I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't stop moving. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. The drive out was worse than coming in. Every bump and jolt on the rough trail felt like it was taking years off my life. I kept imagining I'd see someone in my mirror, or worse, that my truck would break down and I'd be stranded out there. When I finally hit the main road hours later, I almost cried with relief. I didn't stop driving until I was back in Colorado, exhausted, dirty, and running on adrenaline fumes. I never reported it. I figured no one would believe me anyway. And honestly, I didn't want to go back to show anyone where it happened. I just wanted to forget. It's been years now, and I still think about it sometimes. I still camp, but never alone. Never that deep in the woods. I stick to busy parks, crowded campsites, places with other people close enough to hear if something goes wrong. I don't know who or what was out there those nights. I don't want to know. But one thing is clear. There are places out there where you aren't supposed to be. And sometimes, if you ignore the warnings, you find out why. I was 32 years old the summer it happened. It was 2022, and I had been working in corporate insurance sales for almost a decade. I wasn't a top dog, but I was doing fine. I lived alone in a small apartment just outside Kansas City, Missouri. I didn't have much family left, and most of my friends had moved away or gotten too busy with families of their own. I wasn't unhappy, but there were definitely days I felt like I was drifting. That July, my company decided to hold a leadership retreat. They said it was for team building and strategic planning, but everyone knew it was just an excuse for the regional managers to get drunk in the woods. It was supposed to be a casual camping trip. No big hotels, no PowerPoint presentations, just tents, hiking boots, and late-night bonfires. We'd been assigned to groups based on our sales regions. My group would be meeting up at a state park about 3 hours west of the city, somewhere close to the small town of Newton. There were 8 of us. I didn't know any of them well. I recognized a couple of faces from company Zoom calls, but that was about it. The only real instruction we'd been given was to bring our own camping gear, food, and anything we needed to survive 3 days out there. Corporate would reimburse us later. A few people complained about that, but I figured it might actually be a nice break from the regular grind. On the morning we were supposed to leave, I packed up my old tent, a sleeping bag, 2 coolers of food and drinks, a small propane stove, some clothes, and a few basic supplies like a flashlight, bug spray, and first aid kit. I wasn't a seasoned outdoorsman, but I had gone camping a few times when I was a kid with my uncle, so I felt okay about it. I filled my truck with gas, double-checked that I had everything, and headed out. The drive was mostly flat farmland. Mile after mile of brown and green fields baking under a heavy blue sky. The deeper into the country I got, the more the radio stations dropped off until I was flipping between static and old country songs. I finally made it to the meeting point, a dusty gravel lot at the edge of the state park around noon. There were already a few other cars and trucks parked there. People were milling around, adjusting gear, stretching, drinking from water bottles. I recognized a couple of them from email chains. A tall blonde guy named Derek, a woman named Elise who always wore bright scarves on Zoom, and a heavyset guy named Marcus who ran the Oklahoma region. The others were strangers. We waited for another 30 minutes until everyone showed up. The unofficial leader of our group, a guy named Scott from the Denver office, clapped his hands and pointed us toward a trailhead. According to him, the campsite was about 2 miles in, next to a small lake. No vehicles allowed past the parking lot. We had to hike everything in. It was brutally hot. The trail wound through scrubby oak trees and low brush. Dust clung to the sweat on my arms and neck. My pack felt heavier with every step. After about an hour of hiking, we reached a clearing by the lake. There wasn't much there. Just a couple of old fire pits made of stones, some rough picnic tables, and a couple of dry, cracked logs people had dragged over to sit on. The water looked murky and still, a gray-brown surface broken only by a few insects skimming across it. We spread out and started setting up camp. I found a relatively flat patch of ground a little back from the water and pitched my tent there. Some of the others grouped closer together, their tents nearly touching. I didn't mind being a little farther out. I figured it would be quieter at night. Once everything was up, we spent the afternoon half-heartedly team building, mostly sitting around, making awkward small talk, throwing a frisbee, and complaining about the heat. Around dusk, Scott got a fire going. We cooked hot dogs and drank beer from the coolers we'd lugged in. For a while, it actually felt nice, relaxed. No emails, no deadlines, no phones buzzing. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the bugs came out in full force. Big, whining mosquitoes and moths the size of your thumb. We slapped at them and sprayed ourselves with DEET until the air smelled like chemicals. Someone pulled out a Bluetooth speaker and started playing music. It was mostly old rock songs and country ballads. I leaned back against a log, watching the flames snap and pop, feeling the beer buzz settle into my chest. By midnight, most people had turned in. I stayed up a little longer, poking at the fire, staring into the dark woods beyond the ring of light. There was something unsettling about how empty it felt. No city noise, no headlights, no houses. Just endless black trees and the slow, steady chirping of crickets. I finally crawled into my tent around 1 in the morning. The ground was hard and uneven under my sleeping bag. I shifted around, trying to find a comfortable position, listening to the sounds outside. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart jump a little. But eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up sticky and sore, blinking against the harsh morning sun. We had a lazy breakfast, instant coffee and granola bars, and then set off on a group hike around the lake. It was supposed to be another team-building exercise, but it mostly turned into a slow, sweaty trudge. The trail was overgrown in places, with thorny bushes grabbing at our clothes and spiderwebs stretched across the path. At one point, we passed an old abandoned structure tucked into the trees. It looked like it had once been a ranger's cabin, a squat, weathered building with half the roof caved in. We joked about staying there instead of the tents, but nobody went too close. There was something wrong about the place. It didn't feel haunted, exactly, just forgotten. Like if you stepped inside, you might fall through the floor and nobody would find you for weeks. After the hike, we spent most of the afternoon swimming in the lake to cool off. The water was slimy and smelled faintly of algae, but it was better than roasting in the sun. A few people tried fishing with hand lines, but I don't think anyone caught anything. By dinner, a few of us were nursing sunburns and minor scrapes from the trail. That night, the mood shifted a little. People were a little quieter around the fire. Maybe it was the heat or the bugs or just the general weariness setting in. I kept catching Derek glancing off into the woods like he was expecting something to come crashing through the trees. Scott drank more than he should have and passed out half in, half out of his tent. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't relax. Something about the campsite felt different, like the woods were holding their breath. I brushed it off as paranoia, tried to focus on roasting a marshmallow over the fire. But when I went to bed, I had a hard time sleeping. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside my tent. Soft, shuffling steps like someone circling. Every time I sat up and listened hard, the sound would stop. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the gray light of dawn filtering through the nylon walls. The third day was when everything went wrong. We were supposed to have one final morning meeting by the fire before packing up. Just a casual chat about goals and reflections. But when I walked over to the fire pit, coffee mug in hand, something was off. Elise and Marcus were already there, looking tense. Derek was pacing near the trees, glancing around like he was looking for something. Scott wasn't there at all. At first, we thought he might still be passed out in his tent. But when Derek went to check, the tent was empty. His sleeping bag was unzipped and pushed aside. His boots were gone. His pack was missing, too. It looked like he had just gotten up and walked off in the middle of the night. We tried calling for him, shouting into the woods. No answer. After an hour of searching, we regrouped by the fire, sweaty and frustrated. It didn't make sense. Scott was a loud, cocky guy. The idea of him wandering off alone without telling anyone was bizarre. And it wasn't like there were a lot of places to go. The park wasn't huge, but the woods were dense and confusing. If he had gotten lost, he could be wandering in circles a mile away. We argued for a while about what to do. Eventually, Marcus and Elise decided to hike back to the parking lot and call for help. The rest of us stayed at the camp in case Scott came back. I didn't like it, sitting there, feeling useless, staring into the trees. The feeling that something was wrong was almost overwhelming now. An hour passed, too. No sign of Marcus and Elise. No sign of Scott. The sun climbed high and hot overhead, baking the clearing. Derek and I decided we couldn't just sit there anymore. We grabbed our water bottles and started down the trail toward the parking lot. The trail looked different in the harsh light. Shadows pooled under the trees. Every bush and fallen branch looked like something crouching, waiting. I tried to shake it off, just the heat messing with my head. About halfway to the parking lot, we found Marcus. He was lying in the brush a few feet off the trail. His face was pale, sweaty, twisted in pain. His ankle was swollen and twisted at a sick angle. He said he had tripped trying to run back toward camp. Elise was still ahead, he said, but he hadn't seen her in a while. We helped him sit up, but he couldn't walk. Derek stayed with him while I kept going. Back in the fall of 2017, when I was 23, me and my buddies from the NAB team decided to go for a camping trip deep into the woods. It wasn't anything official, just a few of us who were close, wanting to get away from the noise for a few days. We'd planned it for a while, picking a spot way out in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, somewhere you couldn't hear traffic and the cell phone reception disappeared after the first few miles in. It was supposed to be one of those weekends you remember for the rest of your life, and it was just not for the reasons we thought. The team was made up of me, Andy, 24, Marcus, 22, Liam, 23, and Brett, 25. We'd been tight for a couple years, doing training exercises, survival drills, even some basic search and rescue stuff. We trusted each other, and that was important for what was about to happen. We packed light, just enough to last 3 nights. Tents, sleeping bags, fire starters, basic food, water filters, a couple of knives, and gear to cook over a fire. We all carried radios too, the kind that worked over a few miles, just in case we got split up. The plan was to hike about 6 miles from the dirt road where we left the trucks. Past the second ridge was a spot Liam swore he found once when he was hiking alone. A little clearing near a small creek. Sounded perfect. The first day was smooth. We parked around noon, packed up our gear, and started hiking. The sun was out but low already because of the thick trees. You could feel the cold coming through the woods. That sharp early October chill where the air bites your skin and your breath comes out in little white puffs. The forest was thicker than I expected. Pines mostly, tall and skinny, reaching up like black poles into the sky. The ground was soft, covered in dead needles and moss, and everything smelled damp and earthy. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that almost hums in your ears. Just the crunch of our boots, the occasional snap of a branch. Took us a little longer than planned to get there. By the time we found the clearing, it was close to sunset. We set up quick 2 tents, one for me and Marcus, one for Andy and Brett. We built a fire pit with rocks we found by the creek, got a fire going, and cooked some canned stew and hot dogs. Sitting around the fire, I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. No noise, no traffic, no phones buzzing. Just the 4 of us, the woods, and the fire crackling. The first night was uneventful. I slept hard, woke up once to take a leak and looked up to see a sky packed with stars, clearer than I'd seen in years. It was freezing out, and my boots crunched in the frost that had already formed on the grass. The next day we spent exploring. We followed the creek for a few miles upstream, found an old deer stand falling apart in the trees, even saw some fresh tracks. Deer, raccoon, probably a fox. Normal stuff. We were careful not to stray too far from camp, keeping an eye on the sun and checking our handheld GPS every hour or so. Around mid-afternoon, we headed back to camp. That's when we noticed it. Someone had been there. At first, it was just little things. Our campfire was messed with, the logs weren't the way we left them. Brett's pack had been unzipped and rifled through, stuff pulled out and dumped on the ground. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear someone had been there. It was a weird feeling. Out there, that far in, you don't expect to see anybody. Most people can't even find their way that deep. And whoever it was, they didn't leave a note, didn't leave anything behind. Just messed with our stuff. We all kind of played it off, trying to shake it off like it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon, we said, even though we all knew no raccoon was unzipping a heavy-duty backpack. We decided to tighten up. We set up a tripwire around the camp using fishing line and little bells we kept for this kind of thing. Not exactly high-tech, but good enough to wake us if someone or something came poking around. That night, the woods felt different. Still no sound, no crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the fire crackling and the wind hissing through the pines. We kept the fire small, sat close together, talking low, mostly just swapping old team stories. I couldn't stop checking the tree line. Every few minutes, my eyes would flick over to the dark wall of trees just beyond the reach of the firelight. felt like something was out there, watching, waiting. We all went to bed around midnight. I fell asleep eventually, but it was a shallow, restless kind of sleep where every little noise jerks you half awake. Sometime deep in the night, the bells rang. Not loud, just a faint jingle like something brushing the wire. I snapped awake, heart pounding. I laid there, frozen, listening. For a minute, nothing. Just the wind picking up, making the tent walls ripple. Then another jingle, closer this time. I reached over and shook Marcus. He was already awake, breathing shallow. Neither of us moved. We didn't say a word, just listened. Crunch, a footstep, heavy, slow, about 10 feet from the tent. Crunch, crunch, moving around the tent, slow and deliberate. I gripped my knife under the sleeping bag. Not much use against a gun, but it made me feel less helpless. I could hear Marcus doing the same. Whoever it was, they circled the tent once, maybe twice. I could hear their breathing at one point, slow, controlled, like they were trying to be quiet but weren't used to the silence of the deep woods. Eventually, the footsteps faded away toward the creek. I don't think I slept after that. When daylight finally came, we all crawled out of the tents, faces pale, nerves fried. None of us said much. We packed up fast, deciding to cut the trip short. It wasn't worth it anymore. But when we went to grab our packs, we realized it wasn't over. Every pack had been slashed open. Not stolen, just ruined. Food dumped out, water containers sliced, sleeping bags shredded. Someone had taken a knife to everything. Not one of us had heard it. Couldn't have been more than an hour or two before sunrise. We didn't waste time. We grabbed what we could salvage, ditched the rest, and started hiking out fast, sticking tight together, heads on a swivel. No joking around, no sightseeing, just moving. The woods were dead silent again. No birds, no wind, just that oppressive, smothering quiet. After about an hour, we stopped for a breather. That's when we found the footprints. Not ours. Bigger, wider, heavy boots, maybe steel-toed. Fresh too, pressed deep into the soft earth. They weren't headed back toward the road. They were following us. The sick feeling in my gut turned into full-on fear. We weren't alone out there, and whoever was following us wasn't interested in making friends. We picked up the pace, practically jogging now, stopping only to double-check the map and make sure we were still on course. Another hour passed, then another. At one point, I swear I saw something through the trees, just a flash of movement, a dark shape keeping pace with us maybe 50 yards off to the right. Too far to make out clearly, but close enough to know we weren't imagining things. We didn't talk about it. We just moved faster. By mid-afternoon, we finally saw the road through the trees. Relief hit me so hard I almost dropped my pack and ran. We burst out onto the dirt road, panting, filthy, and half frozen. The trucks were still there, thank God, untouched. We didn't even bother checking for damage. We threw the gear into the beds, piled into the cabs, and peeled out, tires spitting gravel. I didn't start breathing normal again until we hit the main highway an hour later. We never reported it. What could we say? Some psycho in the woods messed with our stuff and scared the hell out of us? No proof, no faces, nothing. We didn't talk about it much after, either. It hung over us, unspoken, like a bad scar you don't want to poke at. That night, safe at home, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window set my nerves jangling. I kept seeing that dark shape in the trees, kept hearing the faint jingle of the bells. It's been years now, and I still don't go deep into the woods anymore. Not without backup. Not without a lot more firepower. And I always make sure someone knows exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. I learned something out there, something they don't teach you in training. It's not just bears or bad, whether you have to watch for in the wild. Sometimes the most dangerous thing out there is another person. And sometimes they find you first. I was 26 years old when I decided to go camping alone one rainy October weekend in 2018. I had been feeling boxed in from working a desk job at a trucking company in Kansas City, Missouri, and I just needed a break from the office lights and small talk. I planned to head a couple hours south to a place called Pine Hollow State Forest, a quiet stretch of woods that not many people bothered to visit, especially not in the fall when it got cold and the rains came heavy. I packed light, a one-person tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, 2 changes of clothes, a rain jacket, some food in a cooler, my old Ruger .22 just in case, and the usual small camping gear. A first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, tarp, water jug, matches, lighter, and a small propane stove. I didn't tell too many people I was going. Just left a text with my brother saying I'd be back by Sunday night. It was already raining when I left on Saturday morning. Big sheets of it blurred the highway, and by the time I made it to the forest turnoff around noon, the dirt roads leading into the deeper parts of the woods were already muddy and slick. My little pickup truck slid a little as I turned in, tires spinning before catching. The deeper I drove, the less I could see. The forest got thicker and darker, the rain pounding on the roof of the truck so loud it was hard to think. I passed a few wide, cleared areas where people normally camped, but they were all flooded out. Big puddles swallowed the ground in low spots, and everything else looked like a swamp. After driving another half hour down rougher, narrower roads, I finally found a spot that looked higher and drier than the rest. A little clearing where the trees opened up and the ground rose a little above the rest of the forest. It wasn't much, but it would do. I pulled off, parked crooked under some dripping pine trees, and got out into the cold rain. It wasn't hard rain like a summer storm. It was that heavy, soaking fall rain that just came straight down, cold as hell, steady, like a curtain. I moved fast, threw a tarp over the truck bed, pulled my gear out, and started setting up my tent a little ways from the truck, up on a slight rise where the ground looked firm. The mud sucked at my boots, and every time I knelt down to stake the tent, my jeans soaked through. By the time I had the tent up and the rain fly stretched tight, I was freezing, soaked to the skin, and already questioning why the hell I thought this was a good idea. I got inside the tent just long enough to change into dry clothes, then huddled in the truck cab with the heater on full blast until my hands stopped feeling numb. The plan was simple: spend one night out here, wake up early Sunday, and drive back. No big hikes, no crazy adventures, just a night away from everything. The rain didn't let up. It just kept falling, steady and cold. By mid-afternoon, it was already dim like evening. I couldn't even hear the forest over the sound of the rain. No birds, no wind in the trees, just the constant drumming on the leaves and my truck. Around 4 p.m., I cooked a quick meal on the propane stove, sitting under the back hatch of the truck to stay a little dry. Canned soup, stale bread, some beef jerky. Simple stuff. After eating, I thought about walking around a bit, maybe stretch my legs, but the ground was a mess and I didn't want to slip and bust an ankle in the middle of nowhere. Instead, I cleaned up, locked the cooler back in the truck, checked my tent one more time, and crawled inside for the night. I brought my Ruger and flashlight with me, just to be safe. It got dark fast. By 6 p.m., it was pitch black outside. The rain still came steady, drumming hard on the tent roof, little streams of water gurgling somewhere in the brush nearby. I lay there, bundled in my sleeping bag, listening. That's when I started feeling uneasy. First, I thought it was just being alone. It's easy to get spooked when you're by yourself in the woods, especially in bad weather. Every little noise feels bigger. Every creak or splash sounds like something moving. But this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I kept telling myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer passing through, maybe a raccoon or something nosing around for food. But the longer I lay there, the stronger the feeling got. It wasn't just the rain I was hearing. Somewhere behind it, beneath it, I could hear something else. A rhythm that didn't match the rain. Soft, almost like footsteps. Slow, squelching a little like boots in the mud. I stayed absolutely still, my heart hammering in my chest. I clicked off my flashlight. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to see any light. The steps got closer, not fast, slow, almost cautious, like someone trying not to be heard over the rain. But I could hear it just barely. Wet, sucking sounds in the mud. Heavy steps. I tightened my hand around the grip of my Ruger, heart thudding in my ears. I didn't move. I barely breathed, The steps circled the tent once, slow and deliberate. I could hear breathing now, heavy, wet breathing, like someone out of shape and tired. I squeezed my eyes shut, listening, frozen. Then nothing. Silence except for the rain. Minutes passed. Maybe 20, maybe 30. I lost track. I didn't dare move. I didn't even turn on the flashlight. I just stayed there, every nerve straining. When I finally opened my eyes, it was full dark inside the tent. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the rain for any sign that whoever had been there was still nearby. Eventually, exhaustion won out. Sometime in the early morning hours, I drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was still raining. A little lighter now, more of a mist than a downpour. The world outside the tent was gray and wet and cold. I dressed fast, packed up my sleeping bag, and crawled out of the tent into the mud. Everything was soaked. My boots sank an inch deep into the muck with every step. The truck was sitting low, almost stuck. I glanced around, heart hammering again. At first, I didn't see anything. Just wet trees, gray skies, puddles everywhere. Then I spotted them. Boot prints. Not mine. Big, deep boot prints circling the tent. Sinking heavy into the mud, clear as day. They weren't there when I set up camp. I knew that for a fact. I hadn't walked circles around the tent. And they weren't fresh from that morning either. The rain had softened the edges, made them sag a little, like they'd been made hours ago. Sometime in the night, I swallowed hard, scanning the woods. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anything but the soft, misty drizzle coming down through the trees. I didn't waste time. I tore the tent down in about 2 minutes flat, wadding it up into the bed of the truck. Didn't even bother folding it. I just threw everything in, slammed the tailgate shut, and scrambled into the cab. The truck tires spun in the mud as I tried to pull out. I had to rock it, back and forth, gunning the engine, heart pounding, trying not to panic. Finally, with a great sucking sound, the tires caught and I lurched forward. I didn't look back. I followed the rutted dirt road, fishtailing through the mud, windshield wipers barely keeping up with the misty rain. Branches scraped the sides of the truck as I barreled through the narrow forest paths, trying to put as much distance between me and that campsite as fast as I could. It took almost an hour to make it back to the main road. By then, the rain had mostly stopped, just a fine drizzle misting down from the low gray sky. The paved road looked like salvation when I finally hit it, the tires humming on the wet asphalt. I drove straight back to Kansas City without stopping. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. When my brother asked how the trip was, I just said it rained too much and I came home early. Left it at that. But the feeling stayed with me. Somewhere out there in the rain, someone had been standing just outside my tent, watching, circling, breathing, waiting. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know if they were just curious or if they were planning something worse. All I know is if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I hadn't stayed quiet and still, maybe that night would have ended very differently. I never went back to Pine Hollow after that. I sold my old camping gear at a garage sale a few months later and haven't been camping alone since. Some nights when it rains, that cold, soaking fall rain, I still think about it. Still wonder who was out there. Still wonder what would have happened if I had made a sound, or turned on my flashlight or stepped outside. And I'm glad I never found out. It was 2019, and I had just turned 28. I had been working nonstop at a construction company in Melbourne, barely taking any time off in the last few years. When I finally got a week of leave, I decided to head out on a solo camping trip. I didn't want to go to a crowded place where families and tourists packed every bit of open space. I wanted something quieter. A mate of mine once mentioned a spot called Dargo High Plains, a remote area deep in Victoria's alpine country. Not many people went that far unless they were serious about four-wheel driving or were old bushmen who knew the land like the back of their hand. It sounded perfect. I spent a full day packing my old Hilux, loading it with everything I thought I might need: my tent, a couple of tarps, a thick sleeping bag, a small gas stove, plenty of food and water, a hatchet, and even an old .22 rifle for safety. Not that I thought I'd need it, but out bush, you never knew. Snakes, wild dogs, and feral pigs were real problems out there. I also threw in my big Maglite torch, a few knives, and a first aid kit. The drive took nearly 8 hours. The paved roads slowly gave way to dirt tracks, and my GPS stopped working properly after a while. Good thing I had printed out some old maps and written down some rough directions. The farther I drove, the thinner the trees got, replaced by vast open plains and patches of dense eucalyptus forests. At one point, I didn't see another car for almost 3 hours. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed untouched for a long time. There were no fire pits, no tire tracks, and no rubbish. It was perfect. A narrow creek ran nearby, and the land was flat enough for a tent. I set up camp quickly, pitching my small green tent under a few large gum trees that gave a bit of shade. After securing the tarps and gathering some fallen branches for a small fire, I made myself a simple dinner of canned beans and sausages. I sat by the fire as the sun sank below the distant hills, painting the sky in layers of purple and orange. There was no sound except for the crackling fire and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. No cars, no voices, nothing. It was peaceful, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could actually breathe properly. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and slid into my sleeping bag. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds outside. The occasional snap of a twig, the distant calls of night birds, and once or twice, what sounded like the howl of a dingo way off in the hills. I wasn't worried. I had camped plenty of times before, and the Australian bush at night could sound eerie, but most of it was harmless. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight. I woke up with a jolt. I didn't know what woke me at first. The fire had died down outside, and the only light came from the half-moon overhead. I lay perfectly still, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like boots pressing down on dry leaves. It was far off at first, but it was definitely footsteps. My heart thudded in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. The steps were slow, deliberate, and coming closer. I quietly unzipped the small flap of my tent just enough to peek out. At first, I saw nothing, just the silver trees and the dying glow of my fire. I kept looking, my eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. Then I spotted something, a figure standing just at the tree line. A man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows, watching my camp. I stayed absolutely still, barely daring to breathe. I couldn't make out his face, but he wore a long, dark coat, and something about the way he stood, so still, so patient, made my skin crawl. I slowly pulled my head back inside the tent and reached for my Maglite and the rifle. I didn't want to shine the torch yet and give away that I knew he was there. I sat there, rifle resting across my lap, trying to figure out what to do. Minutes passed, maybe more than that. The footsteps started again. This time they circled the clearing, slow and methodical, like he was checking out the place, maybe looking for something. I sat frozen, listening to him move. Every muscle in my body was tense. Part of me thought about making a run for the truck, but my keys were still in my backpack, and the truck was parked a little way down the track. If he was armed, I wouldn't make it 20 feet. Finally, after what felt like an hour, the footsteps faded into the distance. I stayed inside the tent until the first gray light of dawn started to seep into the sky. When I finally crawled out, rifle in hand, the clearing was empty. There were no signs of him. No tracks, no rubbish, nothing. I packed up camp fast, shoving everything into the truck in record time. I drove out of there without even making breakfast, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. But the story didn't end there. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was he? What was he doing out there in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? Was he just a hunter, another camper? Or was he something worse? I went back home and tried to forget about it. I told myself it was nothing, just a random weirdo or some farmer checking out who was on his land. But it kept gnawing at me. A few months later, I stumbled across a news article while scrolling online. Caught my attention straight away. A body had been found not far from the Dargo area. a backpacker who had gone missing around the same time I had been camping there. They didn't release a lot of details, but police said it looked like foul play. I sat there staring at the screen, my blood running cold. I thought about that figure in the trees, standing there in the dark, watching me. I wondered if it was the same person. I wondered if that could have been me lying out there instead. From then on, I made a rule for myself. No more solo trips. No more camping in places where no one could hear you scream. It just wasn't worth it. The Australian bush could be beautiful, quiet, and peaceful, but it could also hide things and people you didn't want to meet. I still camp now and then, but I stick to well-known parks, places with rangers and lots of other campers around. I never told anyone about that night, not really. What could I even say? It sounded like something out of a movie, but sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I think about how close I might have come. How one bad decision, one sound, one moment of hesitation could have made all the difference. And every time I think about heading back out into the wild alone, I remember the man in the trees, standing so still, so quiet, just watching. And I stay home. It was late October 2018 when I decided to take a camping trip with my dog, Cody. I was 28 then, living in a small town outside of Grand Junction, Colorado. Life had been kind of heavy that year. Work was dragging me down, bills piling up, and I just needed to breathe somewhere away from everything. I thought maybe a few days out in the woods would help reset my mind. No phones, no people, just me, Cody, and the sound of trees moving in the breeze. I picked a spot up in the Grand Mesa National Forest, a few hours' drive from town. It was remote but still close enough that if something went wrong, I could hike back to my truck in half a day. I packed light, my old green tent, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, a few cans of soup, some jerky, basic cooking gear, a hunting knife, a flashlight, a hatchet, and some bottled water. I packed a few extra things for Cody too: kibble, a collapsible bowl, and his thick orange collar with the reflective strip. Cody was a big dog, a German Shepherd mixed with maybe some lab, and he never strayed far from me. We left early on a Friday morning. The drive up was beautiful, the trees fiery with fall colors, golds and deep reds. The sun cut through the thin clouds, lighting up the mountains in the distance. Cody stuck his head out the window most of the way, tongue lolling, eyes squinting into the cold air. By noon, we reached the rough dirt road leading to the trailhead. I parked at a wide shoulder where the ground was flat enough, slung my backpack on, clicked Cody's leash, and started hiking. The trail climbed steeply at first, switchbacking up a rocky slope scattered with pine needles. After about an hour, it leveled out into dense forest. The trees here were thick, mostly pines and firs, and the ground was soft with fallen needles. I could tell right away nobody had been through there for a while. No fresh boot prints, no broken branches. It was quiet, just the faint crunch of my boots and Cody's soft panting. I planned to set up camp near a small alpine lake I had seen on the map. It wasn't an official campsite, more like a hidden gem you only found if you knew where to look. It took another 2 hours of steady hiking before we reached it. The lake was perfect, ringed by tall trees, the water dark and still, the surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a falling pine needle. I could smell the sharp, clean scent of the forest, mixed with the rich, damp smell of the earth. I picked a spot about 30 yards from the water's edge, where the trees opened up enough to let in some light but still offered some protection from wind. I unrolled the tent and got to work. Cody nosed around the site, sniffing everything with interest but never wandering too far. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was dipping low, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I built a small fire in a ring of rocks, fed Cody, and heated up a can of stew for myself. I ate sitting on a flat rock, my back against a tree, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. Cody curled up next to me, his body warm against the chilly air. As night fell, the forest came alive with small sounds, twigs snapping, distant rustles. I wasn't worried. Animals move around at night. Deer, raccoons, squirrels. I tossed some more wood onto the fire, watching the flames leap and dance. When I finally climbed into the tent, Cody followed, circling twice before settling at my feet. I zipped up the door and let the fire burn down outside, the soft orange glow flickering against the tent walls. I slept hard for a few hours but woke up sometime deep in the night. It was cold, the kind of cold that bites at your nose and ears. I listened for a while, hearing nothing but the wind sighing through the trees. Cody lifted his head, ears perked, but after a minute he settled back down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders and drifted back to sleep. The next morning was clear but colder than I expected. My breath came out in white puffs as I broke down camp and packed up for a day hike. I wasn't planning to move sites, just wanted to explore a little around the lake. I stuffed a day pack with water, a few snacks, and my knife, and set out with Cody trotting ahead, tail wagging. We hiked for a few hours, moving slowly, following game trails and weaving between the trees. Around mid-morning, we stumbled across something odd. At first, it looked like a pile of old clothes dumped against a fallen log. As I got closer, I realized it was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. It had been picked clean, bones stripped of meat, but not by natural decay. It looked too fresh for that. Flies buzzed thick around it. Some of the bones had deep grooves and scratches, not the clean tear you'd expect from coyotes or scavengers. Cody growled low in his throat, the fur on his back standing up. I felt a prickle along my spine. Something about it wasn't right. I pulled him back and we skirted wide around it, moving quicker now. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a mountain lion kill, or maybe scavengers had gotten sloppy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. The day passed slow and uneasy after that. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow looked deeper. Cody stayed closer to me, no longer bounding ahead but keeping pace right at my side. I checked my watch constantly, counting down the hours until I could retreat to the safety of the tent. We made it back to camp by late afternoon. I built the fire higher than before, fed Cody, and tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see eyes staring back. That night was worse. The wind picked up after dark, hissing through the pines. The fire guttered and flared. Cody stayed alert, ears twitching at every sound. Sometime after midnight, he stood up stiffly, growling deep in his chest. I sat up, heart hammering, straining to listen. At first, I heard nothing, just the wind. But then there it was, a soft crunch, then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the edge of our campsite. Cody barked once, sharp and loud, and I fumbled for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The forest beyond the fire's glow was an endless wall of black. I didn't see anything, but I knew someone, or something, was out there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, flashlight on my lap. Cody never settled, pacing back and forth in the tent, occasionally growling at unseen things beyond the walls. Every time I started to doze off, a snap or rustle would jolt me awake. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed up camp faster than I thought possible. My hands were clumsy from cold and lack of sleep, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I clipped Cody's leash and started back down the trail toward the truck. The hike back was brutal. Every few hundred yards, I glanced behind us. Nothing, but the feeling of being followed never left. Cody stayed close, his head low, growling every so often. About halfway back, we came across another unsettling sign. This time it was a tree, a massive pine right next to the trail, with deep, fresh gouges clawed into the bark about 6 feet up. It didn't look like bare marks. Bears leave wide, raking scars. These were narrower, more controlled, like someone had hacked at it with a knife or axe. I didn't stop to examine it. I just kept moving. The trail twisted and dipped through thick undergrowth, and several times I thought I heard something crashing through the woods parallel to us, just out of sight. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped too. The final mile to the truck felt like the longest of my life. When I finally saw the shimmer of sunlight off the metal roof through the trees, I nearly cried from relief. I practically ran the last stretch, yanking the keys from my pocket, fumbling them into the lock. I threw the backpack in the bed, got Cody in the passenger seat, and jumped behind the wheel. I didn't even bother taking off my boots. I started the engine, threw it into reverse, and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind us. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway, miles away from the forest, that I started to breathe normally again. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something step out of the trees. When we got home, I spent an hour just sitting on the floor with Cody, scratching behind his ears, feeling his steady breathing. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was a crazy hunter, maybe some drifter hiding out in the woods, maybe just my imagination fueled by too many nights alone. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that lake. Not ever. I learned something out there. The wilderness doesn't care about you. It doesn't matter how prepared you think you are, how strong or smart you feel. Out there, you're just another animal, and sometimes you're not the top of the food chain. Cody stayed close to me for weeks afterward, always alert, always watching. He sensed it too, that whatever had stalked us out there wasn't something we could explain away with city logic. It's been years now, but sometimes, late at night when the wind rattles the windows just right, I can feel that old fear creeping back in. Not because I believe in ghosts or monsters, but because I know people, real people, can be I had always liked being alone in places most people avoided. Maybe it was because the world felt less loud there. Maybe it was because I felt invisible in normal life and it made sense to hide somewhere nobody would ever look. I don't know. All I knew was that in early October 2016, when I was 26, I decided to spend a night camping in an abandoned graveyard way out past the old highway south of Greenvale, Tennessee. It wasn't a well-known graveyard. You couldn't even find it on Google Maps. I had heard about it from a guy I used to work with. He told me it was called New Hope Cemetery, even though there was nothing new about it. Most of the stones dated back to the late 1800s, and the newest graves were from the 1950s before the town dried up and everyone moved closer to the interstate. I figured it would be peaceful. Just me, my old canvas tent, a cooler full of beer, and the dry fall wind rattling through the dead leaves. I had no plans to do anything crazy. Just camp, maybe take a few photos, and head back to my apartment the next morning. I packed light, a basic sleeping bag, the tent, a headlamp, a small hatchet, a lighter, a flashlight, some instant noodles, and a couple of bottles of water. I also brought my old .22 pistol, not because I expected to need it, but because being alone in the middle of nowhere felt a little less crazy with something solid in my hand. The drive out there was longer than I remembered. The dirt roads had gotten worse, washed out and full of deep ruts from rain. My old Ford Ranger bounced hard as I crept along at 15 miles an hour. The sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the fields and into the thin woods that lined the road. I almost missed the turn. The old wooden sign for New Hope was half collapsed. The words so faded you could only read them if you already knew what it was supposed to say. I pulled the truck as far off the road as I could, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The graveyard was set back about a quarter mile from the road, through a tangle of overgrown brush and scrubby trees. It wasn't fenced, just a wide clearing filled with leaning, cracked tombstones, some no bigger than a loaf of bread, others tall and proud, covered in moss and lichen. The first thing I noticed was how still it was. No birds, no bugs, no distant hum of traffic, just the whisper of the wind sliding through the brittle grass. It wasn't scary. It wasn't anything. Just empty. I picked a spot near the middle, where a big live oak threw a crooked shadow over a cluster of headstones. The ground was mostly flat, though a little soft, and I stomped it down before setting up my tent. I worked fast, the way you do when the light's dropping and the cold is starting to creep in. By the time I got the tent up and my sleeping bag unrolled inside, the sky had gone full dark. The stars were sharp and close, and the moon was a pale smear behind thin clouds. I sat outside the tent for a while, drinking a beer and listening to the nothing around me. Stayed calm for a long time. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to walk the edges of the graveyard and take a few pictures with my phone. The flash lit up the tombstones harshly, making long black shadows swing behind them. Most of the names were so worn down I couldn't even read them, I got a weird feeling a few times, like I was stepping on something important, but I kept going. It wasn't until I made it back to my tent that I noticed the first weird thing. My sleeping bag looked different, like it had been moved. It wasn't rolled out flat the way I left it. It was scrunched up toward the far side of the tent. I stood there for a second, shining my flashlight on it, feeling a slow trickle of unease start to build in my gut. Maybe the wind, I thought. Maybe the way I stomped the ground didn't pack it down enough and the bag slid a little. I knew it was a weak excuse, but I made myself believe it. I got inside the tent, fixed the bag, zipped the tent flap shut, and crawled in. I didn't sleep right away. I lay there, listening to the thin breath of the wind outside, the dry rattling of branches. Every now and then, I thought I heard something else, a soft, irregular sound. Not the steady noise of the wind, but something sharper. A footstep, a whisper, I didn't know. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. In a place like that, with all the heavy darkness pressing down, your brain looks for patterns that aren't there. You hear one scrape of a branch, and suddenly it becomes a foot dragging in the dirt. Eventually, I must have drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. It wasn't hard or heavy, just a faint scritch, like fingers dragging lightly across the canvas. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, every muscle tight, listening. The noise came again. Screech. Then a pause. Then a heavier sound, like something tapping the side of the tent once, twice. I slid my hand toward the flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the side of the tent. Nothing. Just the greenish fabric bulging slightly where the breeze pushed against it. I waited, listened. The wind picked up for a second, fluttering the tent walls. Nothing unusual. I told myself it was a branch, maybe, or an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had brushed the tent wasn't an accident. It had felt deliberate, like someone testing the fabric. I unzipped the flap and poked my head out, sweeping the flashlight around. The beam caught on tombstones, the broken trunk of a fallen tree, the dark emptiness beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I stayed like that for a long time, light in one hand, pistol in the other, my heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. Finally, I pulled back inside, zipped the flap again, and sat there with the flashlight resting across my knees. I wasn't going to sleep anymore. That much was clear. Hours dragged by. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, the flashlight started to dim. Batteries dying. I switched to the headlamp, keeping it low to save power. That's when I heard it. A thump, soft but unmistakable, coming from behind the tent, near the oak tree. I killed the light immediately and held my breath. Another thump, closer. Something or someone was moving through the graveyard. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. My mind raced through possibilities. A drunk? A hunter? Some other crazy loner like me? Maybe a homeless guy who used the graveyard as a place to sleep? Another step, crunch of dead grass underfoot. Then another, slow, steady, deliberate. It was coming toward my tent. I raised the pistol, the metal cold and heavy in my hand. I didn't want to fire it unless I had to. A .22 isn't a powerhouse, and if I missed, I might just make things worse. The steps stopped about 10 feet away. Silence. Then, very faintly, I heard breathing. I don't mean the whisper of the wind or the noise of animals. I mean real human breathing. Slow, shallow, raspy. I sat there sweating, trying to think, trying to plan. If they rushed the tent, I wouldn't have much time to react. The thin fabric wouldn't stop a knife or even hands. Minutes passed. Finally, the breathing faded. I didn't hear steps walking away, but somehow, it felt like whatever was out there had moved off. Maybe crouched down behind a headstone. Maybe watching. I stayed inside the tent until first light. I didn't even unzip the flap. Just sat there, my legs cramping, my neck stiff, the gun never leaving my hand. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold and wet, I unzipped the tent and stumbled out. The graveyard looked normal again. Empty, still, but there were footprints, clear as day, deep impressions in the soft ground around the oak tree. not animal prints. Shoes, heavy, wide like work boots. They circled the tent. Twice, I followed them with my eyes, heart hammering. They didn't lead in from the trees. They didn't lead out. It was like whoever made them had just appeared in the middle of the graveyard, circled my tent, and disappeared. I packed up in a frenzy. Tent, bag, cooler, everything jammed into my pack any way it would fit. I didn't bother rolling anything up or cleaning the site. I just wanted to get out. As I stumbled back through the brush toward the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. The graveyard stayed still and empty. When I reached the truck, I tossed everything into the bed and slammed the tailgate shut. I didn't even take a breath until I was halfway back down the dirt road, the tires sliding and bouncing over the ruts. I didn't tell anybody what happened. Who would believe me? No ghosts, no monsters, just some man out there in the dark, watching. I didn't know what he wanted. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. I never went back to New Hope Cemetery. A few weeks later, I tried to find out more about it. I dug through old county records, newspaper archives. Nothing. The graveyard wasn't even listed anymore. But I found one thing, an old article from 1952 about a man found dead near the graveyard. No foul play suspected, the article said, but the details were strange. His pockets were turned inside out, his shoes missing, and he had been found with a look of pure terror on his face. I went camping alone in the summer of 2017, out in a less popular part of Utah, close to the Nevada border. I was 28 years old back then, working a desk job I hated in Salt Lake City. It was one of those stretches where I felt like if I didn't get away for a while, I was going to lose my mind. I didn't want to go to a crowded national park full of people with fancy gear and cameras, so I picked a patch of Bureau of Land Management land I found online. It didn't have any official campsites, just raw land. Miles and miles of open scrub and low, rocky hills. Exactly what I needed. I packed my old Ford Ranger with basic supplies. A small tent, a cooler full of food, 2 gallons of water, a sleeping bag, a basic first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, a couple of extra batteries, and a few other things. I brought my old .22 rifle too, more out of habit than real concern. I wasn't expecting trouble out there, but I always liked having it nearby when I camped alone. The drive out was quiet. Once I got off the paved highways, the roads turned to rough, narrow dirt tracks, winding through low hills and broken desert. Every so often, I'd pass an old rusted fence or a gate leading nowhere, half swallowed by sand and weeds. The air was dry and sharp, smelling like dust and creosote. No clouds, just a wide, hard blue sky pressing down on everything. I drove maybe 40 miles into nowhere before I found a spot that felt right. It was tucked up against the base of a rocky outcrop, with a few scraggly junipers offering a bit of shade. I pulled the truck off the track and set up camp behind a small rise, where I wouldn't be easily seen from the road, not that anyone was likely to come by. By late afternoon, I had the tent set up, a small fire pit built, and a rough seat made out of some flat stones. I cracked open a beer from the cooler, sat back, and listened to the silence. It wasn't the complete silence you get in a soundproof room. It was alive, full of small noises. The whisper of wind through dry grass, the occasional click of insects, a distant bird call, sharp and lonely. After a few hours, the sun started to sag toward the horizon, painting everything in long shadows and deep gold. I ate a simple dinner, cold sandwiches and some chips, and watched the sky catch fire. When the stars came out, they came out hard and fast. I hadn't seen a sky like that in years. The Milky Way was a thick, glowing river overhead. I lay on my sleeping bag outside the tent for a long time, just staring up, feeling small in the best possible way. Around midnight, I packed up my trash, put the cooler back in the truck, and crawled into my tent. I left the rain fly off so I could still see the stars. It was a warm night. I didn't bother with the sleeping bag, just laid on top of it, feeling the dry air move over my skin. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up with a strange feeling. Nothing dramatic, just a prickling at the back of my neck. the kind of thing that drags you out of a dead sleep without any obvious reason. I listened hard. At first, I heard nothing but the same soft sounds. Wind, insects, the creak of dry wood. But after a few minutes, I caught something different. Faint crunch, then another. Footsteps. I lay completely still, heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I told myself it could be an animal, a coyote maybe, or a deer, but it didn't sound right. Too heavy, too slow and deliberate. Not the fast, skittish steps of a wild animal. I slowly reached over and grabbed the flashlight and the rifle. I didn't turn the light on. Instead, I just waited, ears straining. The steps moved closer, then stopped. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it, or maybe it had been a harmless animal after all. I stayed awake until the sky started to pale, then finally dozed off again, the rifle clutched against my chest. The next morning, I stepped carefully around my camp, looking for tracks. The ground was hard and rocky, not good for prints, but near the edge of the little clearing, I found something. A scuffed boot mark, right where the sand was soft enough to hold it. Human, too big to be mine. I stood there for a long time, feeling a pit open in my gut. I hadn't seen another soul for miles. Whoever it was had come close enough to my tent to leave a footprint, then backed off. Why hadn't they just said something if they meant no harm? I thought about packing up right then, but stubbornness kept me there. I had driven a long way to get some peace, and I wasn't going to let one weird night scare me off. I spent the day hiking around the hills, keeping my rifle slung across my back. I didn't go far, never out of sight of my camp. Every now and then, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, sure I was being watched. But the hills stayed empty, hot and silent. When night fell again, I built my fire bigger than usual. I figured light and noise might keep anything or anyone away. I sat up late, drinking coffee and feeding the fire. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the rifle right next to me. This time, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the tent fabric, every shift of the wind set my nerves on edge. It was maybe 2 a.m. when I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, something softer, like the whisper of fabric against fabric. I lay there, muscles locked, listening. Then, from outside the tent, the faintest scrape of something against the nylon. I sat up slowly, barely breathing. Whatever it was, they were right outside. I flicked on the flashlight and jammed it against the tent wall, illuminating the fabric from inside. For a split second, I saw a shape, a person crouched low. They bolted the second the light hit them. I heard their footsteps hammering away across the rocks. I unzipped the tent and staggered out, heart slamming against my ribs, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the darkness. I didn't see anyone, just empty hills and night. I didn't sleep again after that. I packed up camp while it was still dark, stuffing everything into the truck in a blind rush. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly, just jammed it into the back seat. By the time the first gray light touched the horizon, I was already driving back the way I had come, bouncing hard over the ruts and rocks. After maybe 20 minutes of driving, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. A second set of tire tracks. Not mine. They were fresher than the ones I had made coming in. At some point during the night, someone else had driven up that same dirt track, heading toward my camp. I floored the gas pedal and didn't let up until I hit the paved highway again. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't even relax until I was deep into the city, lost in the safety of traffic and noise. When I got home, I unpacked half-heartedly, dropping my gear in a heap by the door. It was only when I pulled out the tent that I noticed something else. A long, shallow slice had been cut into the side of the tent. Not a tear from rocks or branches, a clean cut, like from a knife. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding all over again. Whoever had been out there hadn't just stumbled across my camp. They had been watching, sneaking close enough to touch the tent, close enough to cut it, and they hadn't said a word. I never reported it. What could I say? There wasn't any real evidence, and I hadn't actually seen the person's face. Just a crouched shadow and a footprint in the sand. But after that, I didn't camp alone anymore. Not because of ghosts or monsters, because of people. Because sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't some story you tell around a fire. It's the person who doesn't make a sound, who waits, who watches, and for reasons you'll never know, chooses not to leave you alone. I was 27 the summer I decided to take some time off work and travel through South America. I had saved up for years, picking up random jobs, eating cheap food, and living in small apartments just to have enough to explore places I had only seen on old maps and travel magazines. I picked Colombia, mainly because it was cheap, warm, and full of mountains and forests that still felt wild. I liked being alone, and I didn't mind roughing it if it meant I could wake up somewhere most people had never heard of. It was July 2017 when I flew into Bogota. I spent a few days wandering the city, getting used to the noise, the smells, and the heavy air. After that, I took buses south into the mountains, sometimes hitchhiking with farmers who didn't speak any English. My Spanish was terrible, but I could point and smile enough to get by. By the second week, I found myself deep in the hills near a small town called San Vicente. I had heard from a few backpackers that there were remote trails out there, ones that weren't even on maps, trails you could hike for days without seeing anyone. That was exactly what I wanted. I carried everything on my back: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a lightweight stove, a first aid kit, and about 4 days worth of food. Water I could get from streams if I boiled it. The first day into the hills was incredible. The air smelled like wet earth and flowers. Birds I didn't recognize called out from the trees. In the distance, dark green mountains layered into the mist like folds of a blanket. I followed an old mule trail that wound up the side of a valley, cutting across streams and fields where cows grazed. I hiked until late afternoon before finding a spot under some thick trees, flat enough for my tent. I set up camp, boiled some water for instant noodles, and sat back against my backpack to watch the sunset stain the clouds orange and pink. That night, the forest was noisy with insects and night birds, but it didn't bother me. I fell asleep fast, feeling like I was exactly where I wanted to be. The second day, I kept going deeper. The trail got harder to follow, more overgrown. Sometimes it split off into smaller paths, but I stuck to the ones that looked the most used. Midway through the afternoon, it started raining. A heavy, soaking rain that came fast out of the hot sky. I pulled on a cheap poncho, but it didn't help much. The trail turned to mud, and my boots sucked down into it with every step. I didn't see anyone all day. No houses, no fences, no dogs barking in the distance. Just endless hills and trees and fog rolling over the ground like smoke. That night, I found a clearing that looked safe enough. I set up my tent again, peeled off my wet clothes, and crawled into my sleeping bag, shivering a little even though it was still warm outside. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of branches snapping nearby. I lay there completely still, breathing as quietly as I could. It wasn't an animal moving. It was the careful, slow sound of someone stepping through the brush. A two-legged shuffle, not the quick, darting noise deer or pigs make. I reached out slowly and gripped the handle of my knife, which I kept by the sleeping bag just in case. I stayed like that, frozen, for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the noise faded away. I told myself it had just been a cow wandering by. There were cows everywhere around here. I must have scared it off. Still, it took a long time to fall back asleep after that. The next morning, I packed up fast and moved on. I kept telling myself it had been nothing, but I still kept looking over my shoulder more than usual. By late afternoon, the trail had basically disappeared. I figured I must have wandered off it without realizing. I pulled out my map, but it was useless now. I had no signal on my phone, not even a bar. I wasn't too worried though. I had my compass, and I knew that if I kept heading west, eventually I'd hit the river valley where there were more farms and maybe a road. That third night, I camped by a little stream. I set up my tent farther from the water than usual because I didn't want animals coming to drink and stumbling over me in the dark. I built a small fire just to keep my spirits up, even though it wasn't really cold. I sat there watching the flames flicker, eating cold tuna from a can, feeling more tired than I should have. That night, I had a dream about someone standing outside my tent, pulling at the corners of it gently, almost testing it. When I woke up, the tent was still standing, but I found a single muddy handprint smeared low on the fabric near where my head had been. My stomach dropped when I saw it. The handprint was small, not much bigger than my own, but definitely human. I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anything, but someone had been close enough to touch my tent while I was asleep inside. I packed up in record time and started moving. I didn't even eat breakfast. My whole body felt wired, like every muscle was buzzing. The trail, if you could even call it that anymore, was just patches of flattened grass and animal tracks. The trees were thick and the ground climbed steeply uphill. My legs burned with the effort, but I didn't stop. I just wanted to get back to somewhere with people. Around noon, it started raining again, this time even harder than before. The water came down in sheets, soaking through my clothes, my backpack, even the supposed waterproof case around my map. The ground turned into a slick mess of mud and rocks. I slipped and fell hard once, sliding a few feet downhill and banging my knee against a stone. I sat there in the mud for a few minutes, holding my leg and feeling like a complete idiot. I couldn't tell if the knee was badly hurt, but it hurt enough to make walking slower and harder. Still, I kept going. I limped forward, following the pull of the slope downward, thinking it would lead to a river or a farm or anything. Late that afternoon, through the thick gray rain, I spotted something that looked like a shack or an old hut. It was made of wood, with a sagging tin roof and walls that leaned inward like they were tired of standing. It didn't look lived in. No smoke, no signs of recent work. I hesitated for a long time before heading toward it. If someone was there, they might not be friendly. On the other hand, it was shelter, and I didn't want to sleep another night out in the open with whoever was creeping around these hills. The door was hanging open, swinging slightly in the wind. I stepped inside slowly, knife still gripped tight in my hand. The shack was empty except for an old wooden table and a couple of broken chairs. The floor was dirt. One corner was blackened from an old fire. There was a pile of junk in the corner, broken tools, rusted cans, and an old tarp. I checked the whole place carefully, even tapping on the walls to make sure no one was hiding. It was clear. I pulled the door shut and wedged a stick under it to keep it closed. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. I set up my sleeping bag in the cleanest spot I could find and peeled off my wet clothes, hanging them over the broken chairs in a pathetic attempt to dry them. That night, the rain hammered on the tin roof like gunshots. I lay there in the dark, knife still in my hand, listening to the storm and every tiny creak the shack made. At some point, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside, slow, steady steps, crunching the wet ground. I held my breath, heart racing so loud I could feel it in my ears. The steps circled the shack, once, twice, then stopped by the door. I heard the door creak as someone pushed against it gently. It didn't open, the stick held. The pushing stopped. A few minutes later, the steps moved away, fading into the rain. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay there staring into the darkness, knife clutched so tight my hand hurt. When the sun finally rose, the rain had stopped. I packed up and got out of there as fast as my bad knee would allow. Every few minutes I would stop and listen, heart hammering, sure I would hear footsteps again. By midday, I finally stumbled onto a real trail, a wide dirt road, rutted by old tire tracks but definitely used. I almost cried when I saw it. I followed it west for hours, ignoring the ache in my leg and the blisters on my feet. I didn't stop for anything. Around late afternoon, I saw a small house ahead, perched on the edge of a hill. It was simple, white walls, red roof, chickens running around out front. Smoke curled from a chimney. I limped up to it, waving both arms to make sure they saw I wasn't a threat. An older man came out, wary at first, but when he saw the state I was in, muddy, soaked, limping, he called out something in Spanish and waved me inside. I collapsed into a chair by the fire they had going. The man and his wife brought me food, rice and beans and eggs, and talked at me kindly, even though I barely understood. I just kept nodding, grateful beyond words. The next morning, they helped arrange a ride back to the town. From there, I caught a bus north to Bogota. I didn't camp again for the rest of that trip. I stuck to hostels and cheap hotels, always making sure there were locks on the doors and people nearby. I never found out who was in those woods with me. Maybe it was some local trying to scare off outsiders. Maybe it was someone desperate, living rough in the hills, stealing what they could. Maybe it was worse. It didn't matter. I made My name's Aaron Ellis, and this all happened back in late October 2019. I was 26 years old then, living alone in a small town called Verona, just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. My grandfather, Walter Ellis, had passed away that summer. He was 78. He and I were real close, closer than I was with my own dad, if I'm being honest. Grandpa was a big part of my life growing up. He was a retired sheriff, the old school type, tough but fair, the kind of man that didn't say much, but you could tell he meant everything he did say. After he passed, it was like there was this big hole in my life that I couldn't fill no matter what I did. Around mid-October, I started getting these restless nights. I would stay up too late, scrolling through my phone, not really paying attention to anything, just trying to fill the silence. I kept thinking about how Grandpa and I used to go camping out in Coconino National Forest when I was a kid. He taught me how to start a fire with wet wood, how to find true north without a compass, how to listen to the woods and notice when something felt off. I hadn't been camping in years, not real camping anyway. Not the way Grandpa taught me. One night, after another evening of just sitting around doing nothing, I decided I needed to get out. I packed up some gear from the garage, an old Coleman tent, my sleeping bag, a small propane stove, a hatchet, a hunting knife, a flashlight with backup batteries, a first aid kit, 2 gallons of water, and a week's worth of beef jerky and trail mix. I threw it all into the back of my beat-up 2006 Tacoma and decided I was going to spend a few days out in the forest, alone, the way Grandpa would have wanted it. I thought maybe it would help clear my head. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't post about it online. I just loaded up and drove out early one morning. I headed north, off the main highway, onto a maze of old forestry roads that twisted and turned through miles and miles of pines and junipers. I wanted to find somewhere really remote, not one of those crowded campgrounds with paved loops and RV hookups, but a spot way off the beaten path where I wouldn't hear another human voice for days. After about 3 hours of driving, I found a place. It was a narrow clearing surrounded by thick trees, about half a mile from a little seasonal creek that probably dried up in the summer but still had a trickle running through it in October. There were no tire tracks, no fire pits, no signs anyone had camped there in a long time. Felt right. I set up camp under a big old ponderosa pine, the kind that smells like vanilla when the sun heats it up. I pitched my tent facing east so I could see the sunrise through the trees. I gathered some dead wood and built a fire ring out of rocks. It took a while to get everything set up, and by the time I was done, the sun was already starting to dip low in the sky. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, almost. I made a small fire, cooked up some kin soup, and sat staring into the flames, feeling more alone than I had in a long time. I missed Grandpa something fierce. I kept remembering how he used to sit by the fire, whittling sticks with his pocket knife, telling me to pay attention to the way the woods sounded at night. He said you could tell a lot from the sounds. If the crickets suddenly stopped chirping, or if the frogs went silent, you needed to pay attention because something might be out there. I didn't hear any crickets that night. No frogs either. Just the wind moving through the trees, a low whooshing sound that never really stopped. Once or twice, I thought I heard something moving through the underbrush, but it was probably just a rabbit or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, just being alone in the woods after so long. Eventually, I doused the fire, climbed into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little crack or snap from outside made my heart jump. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but something heavier. Something that moved with a rhythm, 2 steps, pause, 2 steps, pause, like a person walking slowly through the trees. I held my breath, listening hard, but after a minute it stopped. I told myself it had to be the wind knocking branches around. Maybe a deer, maybe an elk. Arizona has plenty of both. I finally drifted off sometime around 3 in the morning. The next morning, I woke up to frost on the ground and my breath puffing out in little clouds. It was colder than I expected. I made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, trying to shake off the bad feeling from the night before. After breakfast, I decided to do some exploring. I strapped on my boots, grabbed my knife and water bottle, and headed east, toward the creek. The woods were beautiful in the morning light. The sun filtered down through the tall pines, making the air glow golden. I walked along the creek, hopping from rock to rock, following the water upstream. About half a mile up, I found something odd. There was an old hunting blind built up between 2 trees, camouflaged with branches and leaves. It looked abandoned. The wood was weathered gray, and some of the brush had fallen off. But it didn't look that old. Maybe a few months, maybe less. I climbed up to take a look, but there was nothing inside except an old empty thermos and a shredded tarp. I kept moving upstream. Around noon, I found another strange thing. It was a tree, a big oak that had been stripped of all its bark on one side, from about waist height up to 7 or 8 feet. The bark was just gone, like something had scraped it clean. I ran my hand over the exposed wood. It was rough and splintery. I didn't know what could have done that. Bears sometimes mark trees, but the marks are usually clawed and rough. This was different, more like a long, clean scraping. I didn't like it, but I wasn't ready to pack up and leave just yet. I made my way back to camp slowly, stopping every few minutes to listen. The woods were still too quiet. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. That afternoon, the clouds started rolling in. Thick, heavy gray clouds that blocked out the sun and made the woods feel even darker. I decided to gather a bunch of firewood before the rain hit. I wanted a big fire going that night. I spent 2 hours gathering dry sticks and branches and stacking them under a tarp near the fire ring. By the time I was done, the first fat raindrops had started to fall. The rain came in hard and cold, a real mountain storm. I hunkered down in my tent, reading an old paperback novel by flashlight, trying to ignore the way the wind made the trees creak and groan. The rain slapped against the nylon walls of the tent, a steady drumming that made it hard to hear anything else. I must have fallen asleep for a while because when I woke up, it was dark and the rain had stopped. Everything was wet and cold, and the firewood was damp even under the tarp. I managed to get a small fire going anyway, using some birch bark and the driest sticks I could find. I sat close to the flames, warming my hands, feeling like the woods were closing in around me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there at the edge of the firelight. I didn't, but that didn't make me feel any better. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer, slow, deliberate, crunching wet leaves underfoot. My heart slammed against my ribs. I killed the fire as fast as I could, throwing dirt and wet leaves over it, plunging the camp into darkness. I crouched low, listening. The steps kept coming. Closer. Then they stopped. I stayed crouched there for what felt like an hour, straining my ears, holding my breath. Nothing. No more steps. No sounds at all except the distant drip of water from the trees. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and kept my knife clutched in my hand. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found tracks. Big tracks. Boot prints deep in the mud, leading from the trees right up to where my fire had been, and then around my tent. They circled my tent. Once, twice, then back into the woods. I stood there staring at them for a long time. They weren't my prints. They were bigger and the tread was different. I checked around camp, nothing missing, nothing disturbed. But someone had been here, watching me, walking around my tent while I was inside. I packed up fast. I threw everything into the truck without caring how it was organized. I just wanted to get out. As I was about to drive off, I noticed something on the edge of the clearing. A small pile of rocks, stacked neatly. It hadn't been there before. 3 stones balanced carefully on top of each other. A sign, a warning. I didn't know. I didn't stick around to find out. I drove back down the forestry roads faster than I should have, tires slipping on the wet dirt, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't feel safe until I saw the blacktop of the highway again. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. When I finally got home, it was late afternoon. I locked all the doors, pulled the blinds, and sat on the couch staring at the wall. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those boot prints circling my tent. I never went back to that part of the forest. I never even told anyone about what happened. Part of me felt like it was my fault, like I had gone looking for something out there and found it. It was the summer of 2021 when I decided to take a week off from everything. I was 30 years old, living in a city that always seemed to move too fast. I had been feeling restless for months, dealing with long work hours and a growing sense of disconnect. So, I thought a solo camping trip would be the perfect way to clear my head. I chose the Klamath National Forest in Northern California, a place I'd only read about online. The forest was vast, remote, and relatively untouched, with rugged terrain and few tourists. I wasn't looking for a popular campground with amenities. This trip was about being alone, immersed in nature, away from the hum of everyday life. I packed my gear the night before: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, a cooler with food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a small axe, and plenty of water. I didn't want to overdo it, but I made sure I had the essentials. I loaded it all into my Jeep early in the morning, the sun barely up, and hit the road. The drive took me through winding mountain roads, past small towns, and eventually to a dirt path leading deeper into the forest. By the time I arrived at the site, it was late afternoon. The place was quiet, the air cool, and the shadows from the trees stretched long across the forest floor. I found a secluded clearing by a small creek, far from any marked trail. It was exactly what I had hoped for, a peaceful spot where I could just disappear for a while. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made a small campfire. As I cooked my first meal, I felt a sense of relief, like the weight of the city had lifted off my shoulders. The fire crackled, and the smell of cooking food mixed with the fresh forest scent. It was perfect. That night, the sky was clear, and the stars were bright. I sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones, listening to the sounds of the forest. I heard the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the distant gurgling of the creek. It was the kind of peace I had been craving. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the setup. The air was cool inside the tent, and I fell asleep quickly. But around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't any noise that had stirred me, just a deep, unsettling feeling. I lay there in the dark, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the isolation, or my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint sound coming from outside the tent. A twig snapping, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, like someone walking just outside the reach of my campfire's light. My heart started to race. I knew I was in a remote area, and it was possible someone else was out there, though unlikely. I had checked the map. There were no marked trails nearby, and the nearest campground was miles away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped. For a few long seconds, everything was still. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. Nothing. Then the sound came again, closer this time, like whoever it was had circled around my camp and was now right outside my tent. I froze, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Maybe a deer? No, this was different. These footsteps were too deliberate, too human. I reached for the small flashlight beside me, my hand trembling. Slowly, I turned it on and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light flicked across the clearing, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. No one was there. I exhaled, feeling foolish. It was probably just an animal after all. But then the footsteps started again, this time directly outside my tent. My blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they were moving deliberately, as though they knew I was inside. I didn't dare make a sound. I waited in that tense silence, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, wide-eyed and listening, but nothing else happened. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up quickly, the unease in my chest growing with each movement. I didn't want to stay there any longer, not with the memory of those footsteps lingering in my mind. As I drove back toward the main road, I couldn't help but glance nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. The forest was still and empty, just as it should be. It wasn't until I got back home and did some research that I learned something that made my skin crawl. The area I had camped in, though beautiful, had a dark history. Several years earlier, a man had gone missing in the forest, his campsite abandoned but his belongings left behind. His disappearance was never solved, and to this day, there were whispers among locals about people who'd gone missing in the area, especially in the more remote sections of the forest. I never went back to that spot. I've camped in other places since then, but I always make sure there are other campers around. The forest is beautiful, but it can also be a place where things happen in the quiet, when no one is watching. And some of those things, well, they might not be so easily explained. The fear that gnawed at me on that night never fully went away. I think about it every time I go camping now, and I always double-check my surroundings, just in case. You never really know what's out there in the woods, and that's the scariest part of all. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from the noise of life and go camping alone in the English countryside. I was 29 back then, and life was just heavy. Work, bills, city noise, it never stopped. I needed something different. I needed quiet, something real. So I packed up my old Ford Fiesta with my cheap tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of beans, a little gas stove, a pocket knife, and a flashlight. I threw a waterproof jacket into the pile too, just in case. It was England after all. Rain could come any minute. I didn't plan much. I liked it that way. I drove from my flat in Nottingham out into the Peak District, figuring I'd find a quiet patch of land somewhere remote. I camped a few times before, but mostly with mates. This would be different, just me and the wild. No one telling me what to do, no deadlines, no noise except for the sounds of nature. I ended up parking near a place called Abney Moor. I'd never been there before. It was beautiful, rolling hills, thick patches of forest, the kind of lonely that I wanted. There wasn't a proper car park, just a muddy clearing off the side of a narrow road. It was about 6 in the evening when I arrived, the sky already turning that soft shade of gray that you only see before a rain. I got out, stretched my legs, and breathed deep. It smelled fresh. The air was cool, damp even before the rain started. I walked about 15 minutes off the road, into the scrubby brush, and found a decent spot to pitch my tent. It wasn't perfect. Ground was a little uneven, rocks poked out here and there, but it was hidden from the road, and that was what mattered. I didn't want some nosy dog walker stumbling onto me in the night. I set up my tent in a little dip between two hills. It offered some shelter from the wind at least. By the time I finished, the first drops started to fall. Light at first, barely there. I pulled my jacket tight and set up my little stove just outside the tent. I heated up a can of baked beans and ate straight out of it with a plastic spoon. It wasn't gourmet, but it was warm, and that was enough. The rain got heavier while I was eating, so I crawled into my tent, zipped it tight, and sat back against my rolled-up clothes that I was using as a pillow. I listened to the rain drumming harder and harder against the thin fabric. It was cozy in a weird way. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. I expected that. I turned it off to save the battery and tucked it into my backpack. It must have been around 9 when the light really faded. The rain was steady by then, cold and persistent, not the kind that clears up after a few minutes. I lay back, listening to it, breathing in the damp air, trying to relax. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start. The rain hadn't stopped. In fact, it sounded heavier, almost like a small stream pouring onto the tent. I looked around, disoriented, feeling the dark press against me. My flashlight was right by my head. I grabbed it but didn't turn it on yet. I listened first. There was something else. A sound. It wasn't the rain. It was faint, but it was there. Something shuffling in the wet grass. Something moving slowly, dragging maybe. My heart started hammering in my chest. I lay frozen, trying not to even breathe too loud. The sound wasn't right against the tent, but it wasn't far either. It moved past, slow and heavy. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a badger, some animal just trying to get out of the weather. But something deep in my gut said no. It wasn't the sound of small paws or hooves. It was slower, clumsier, like a person stumbling around. Minutes passed, or maybe it was just seconds. Time felt strange. I didn't hear it anymore, just the rain. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I turned on the flashlight, keeping it low, lighting up just the inside of the tent. I didn't want to give away my position. I lay there, wide awake now, ears straining, muscles tense. I thought about leaving, packing up and hiking back to the car. But the thought of walking through the dark, rainy hills with God knows what out there made my skin crawl even worse. I stayed. The hours dragged. Every so often, I thought I heard something. A stick cracking, wet grass brushing, but it was impossible to tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. At some point, maybe 3 in the morning, I decided I needed to piss. Badly. I didn't want to go out, but it was getting painful. I unzipped the tent slowly, every muscle screaming that it was a bad idea, and poked my head out. The rain was lighter now, just a fine mist. The world outside was a blur of shadows and shifting gray. I shone my flashlight in a small circle around me. Nothing. No movement. No sounds but the rain dripping from the grass. I stepped out, boots squelching into the soaked ground. I didn't wander far, just behind the tent. I kept one hand on the canvas like a lifeline. I finished quick and zipped back inside fast. I laid back down, soaked to the knees but relieved. I must have slept again, because the next thing I remember was waking to a faint scratching sound. Different from before. This was right up close, right against the side of the tent. I froze. The scratching was soft, like fingers brushing against the fabric. Testing it, feeling it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the dark ceiling, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The scratching moved along the side, slow, deliberate. I gripped the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't dare. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Silence. Nothing but rain again. I lay there until dawn. When the first gray light started leaking through the thin material of the tent, I finally moved. I waited another 10 minutes, listening, before I unzipped the flap and looked out. The world was wet and cold, mist curling over the hills. I stepped out carefully, scanning around with my flashlight, even though it was light enough to see a little. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal prints. Human ones. Barefoot. In the cold, wet mud. They circled the tent. Twice. My stomach turned over. Whoever it was had been out here in the freezing rain with no shoes. Walking around my tent. Watching. Listening. I packed up fast. I didn't even bother rolling the tent properly. I just stuffed it into the bag, grabbed my things, and sprinted towards the car, slipping and sliding in the mud. The walk back felt like a lifetime. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made my skin crawl. But I didn't see anyone, just empty hills and mist. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried. I threw everything into the back seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I sat there for a moment, soaked and shivering, hands trembling on the steering wheel. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road without even checking the mirror. I just wanted out. As I drove back toward Nottingham, I kept thinking about the footprints, the way they circled my tent, the way the scratching had moved so slowly along the fabric. I don't know who it was. Some drifter? A local farmer messing with campers? Someone looking to rob me? Or something worse? I never found out. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, years later, whenever it rains at night, I sometimes wake up to the sound of it tapping against the window, and for a split second, I'm back there, lying in the cold, wet dark, listening to something moving outside my tent. But I'm safe now, home, and I'm never, ever going back out there alone.